So over our time together, we have a beautiful 75 minutes, but it may take less than that, may take more than that, and I think we can allow the space to be what it is. I'll share a little bit about my story, our story with introspective spaces, how I got to this work and how I got to this moment. We'll explore, just at a very high level, some of the principles of sustainable activism, kind of what that means in practice. And we'll touch on four different components of it, of which there are many, but the ones that I wanted to talk about would be joy, grief, creativity, and community care. And then in our last creative practice together, we'll design our own ecosystems of care. So this is very interactive, and so I hope for folks to be able to engage in whatever way serves you. If you want to grab paper and pen, we will be doing practices kind of throughout the workshop, and with opportunities for folks to share live if they'd like or in the chat. And so, with our work at Introspective Spaces, we always begin any webinar, workshop, event that we do with our values that we bring as facilitators. And so for us, respect, using everyone's name and pronouns, mutuality, that we commit to dismantling the medical hierarchy, humility, that we remain open and accountable to feedback, compassion, that we listen for understanding, we respect everyone's right to be human, and confidentiality, less so, of course, since this is currently live streamed. But as Adanya and I shared earlier, if folks do want to create this, share things that are vulnerable and don't want that shared publicly later, just let us know. And so I'd like to begin with a moment of grounding, and since I imagine many of y'all are coming from maybe rotations or a long day of studying or any number of things that you're doing on a Tuesday in February, and this won't have an opportunity for our body and mind to get to be in the same place. So I'll encourage everyone to get into a comfortable position. If you're driving or in transit, do whatever works in that setting that you're in. But I'm going to read this poem, and I'm going to read it 2 times. And so the first time, I encourage you to sit, let your breath slow down a little bit, allow yourself to be comfortable, pay attention to where you're sitting, your feet on the floor, where you are in your seat. And the first time I read this poem, feel free to listen if there's a word or a phrase that sticks out to you. Hope by Rosemary Watola Tromer. Hope has holes in its pockets. It leaves little crumb trails so that we, when anxious, can follow it. Hope's secret, it doesn't know the destination. It knows only that all roads begin with one foot in front of the other. Feel free to write down word, phrase that stood out to you. I'll read it one more time, and I want you to notice if there's an image in your mind that comes up as you're listening to this poem. Hope by Rosemary Watola Tromer. Hope has holes in its pockets. It leaves little crumb trails so that we, when anxious, can follow it. Hope's secret, it doesn't know the destination. It knows only that all roads begin with one foot in front of the other. And feel free to ease back into your body, into this breath, into where you are physically located in this moment, and then we'll transition. So I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about my story and the story of our organization. And I always call it our story, mostly because even in my own personal development, it was not in isolation. It was in community of so many friends and family members and teachers and mentors along the way who have helped me get to this moment. And then our story, because fundamentally our work is about really thinking about what role does community care in healthcare. So I'm a pediatrician. I work in a county hospital, and I take care of newborns and premature infants, and I'm very grateful to do the work that I do. When I was in high school, really thinking about my journey into medicine, I was in a family of doctors, so being a doctor was a very unoriginal path that I was like, well, I know what it is, and it seems like a great way to help people. And as I progressed through high school and then through college, my interest in understanding my own values and where they came from only really deepened. And as I was really going through my own exploration of like my own spiritual practices, of really building community and coming into my own identity, I started to really feel a deeper sense that my life was meant to do things that were centering justice. And even though I had maybe more flippantly had decided medicine much earlier in my life because that was what I was exposed to, the more that I reflected on like where I was hoping to be able to do the most good, it did feel like my job as a doctor would be that. And when I started medical school, I trained in the Midwest and am from the Midwest, and I was coming in very armed with a passion for justice that came really extremely out of my time in Arkansas, where I went to high school, and also from my own Hindu Buddhist background. And my ability to articulate that sense of justice was growing, especially in the first couple of years of medical school, when I had time to engage in some of the service projects and activities that I wanted. And I think it was really when I started my rotations in my third year, I felt like the beginnings of a rupture of recognizing that these values that I had brought me into medicine and the medicine that I had imagined practicing that was deeply relational, that was very slow, very human centered, was very different than the medicine that I was witnessing every day. And I spent much of that time really trying to grapple with the reality of what healthcare was, what my place in it was going to be, and now looking back was like felt very harm reduction, where I was like, let me do the most good I can in the limited role and power that I have in this capacity. But I think I also felt very different. Like I felt like I really did not agree with so much of how patients were being treated, how people treated each other in healthcare. And where I went to school, I also felt that so many people were so deeply unhappy that many of the teachers and mentors that I had who were training us to become the next generation of doctors were themselves so burnt out, so exhausted, felt so devalued. And I think many of us were like, what exactly are we training for? This is so tricky. And in our context, that's why many of us went into pediatrics because of all the people we worked with, the pediatricians were the happiest. And in my case, I took a research year and really spent a lot of time thinking about where do I feel like I can find the most alignment with my own values of justice, of wanting to do good not just for individuals, but for communities. And for me, pediatrics felt like that natural intersection of getting to bring in an interest in public health and also to take care of children. And then I started residency, and then I realized, oh, now I'm having to implement these things that I really disagree with in this really different way. And I really had a very hard time. I was just really angry. I was angry for 3 years and was really uncertain if I was going to be able to practice medicine. And I spent much of that time during those 3 years really questioning, like, did I make the wrong decision? Is this not where I should be spending my time? And also, I'd have very beautiful moments where I would get to connect very deeply with families, get to know them very well, get to be a part of these really vulnerable moments. And I was like, oh, I think there may be more to this job and maybe more to this life than what I'm seeing in my training. And when I graduated in 2020 in the pandemic, I was at this crossroads of deciding, is this time for me to leave medicine and just pursue something else, or am I going to give this one last chance? And at that time, my friend and co-founder now, Laura, who's an oncology nurse, was similarly grappling with a lot of the same questions. And she reached out and asked if we could be accountability partners to kind of think about what does this mean to be in healthcare? And for her, she came from her own contemplative spiritual background and was really grappling with how much she felt like what she was doing was not in alignment with her own wishes and her own values for what she believed patients deserved. And it was through our conversations we recognized, like, oh, wait, we aren't the only ones who feel this way. That, in hearing Laura's story, I was like, I'm definitely not alone in thinking that this field I'm in, the way in which people treat each other, what's normal, what is not, I'm definitely not crazy. I'm not the only one thinking that way. And I think in our conversations, we realized this being able to bear witness to each other was almost healing in itself, just to receive that validation and to receive space to get to bring in all the parts of who we were. And so in March 2021, we held a virtual retreat for healthcare workers around the country. And we read piece like narrative writing together. We did poetry, and we had chaplains and nutritionists and physical therapists and doctors and nurses all in a virtual room together. And it was really beautiful. And I think we realized like maybe we're not necessarily the majority of healthcare, but we are definitely not alone in how we feel. And sometimes in each of our work environments, we may feel like the only person, but we definitely are not the only ones. And it was from that experience we started our organization, Introspective Spaces, which is really committed to building this reflective space for healthcare workers to engage and build communities of care using art and ritual, and to do this across the medical hierarchy, to recognize that we have so much more in common with our colleagues who also are working alongside us, and we just don't usually have the spaces to slow down to connect with ourselves, to connect with each other, and ultimately to figure out how do we navigate these systems that we know are harming us and our patients. And when I talk about our work, I think sometimes, especially for folks who are not in healthcare, it can be really hard to fully explain what makes it so complicated. And for me, this was the simplest way I could imagine describing what it is and why it's so hard, and also at times so beautiful and so meaningful. I always think of healthcare as a very hard and meaningful job. And when I came into medical school, the part that I thought would be hard would be the human experience, that I was going to be witnessing deep suffering, like death and dying and illness. And that's the part that I was like, okay, I'm ready to be an accompaniment to people who are witnessing or experiencing unimaginable things. And then I realized the things that were actually hard were the culture of medicine and the structural inequities that I was witnessing every day. And that I was unprepared for. And I realized there's not a lot of places to talk about that. And over the next few slides, I'll talk a little bit more in depth, but I also want to name that this can be really painful to talk about. And so for anyone, if you're noticing within yourself, like, oh, this you're feeling a strong emotional reaction in the context of everything happening politically right now, please feel free to step away, take care of yourself. And I also want to name too that sometimes when we talk more deeply about the culture of medicine and the structural inequities, it can feel very hopeless because what we're talking about are things bigger than us individuals. But I also think there's such a deep power in naming what is going on and being able to give language to these experiences and to talk about it with each other. And so that's why, even though what we'll be talking about is a very big picture description of each of these things, just knowing that for many of us, if we are struggling, it's because there are these intertwined forces that are making it really difficult for us to get to just do the human part of our job. And that a lot of our work as we go through our training and as we find our place in medicine is to figure out what is my capacity to bear and how do I do that sustainably so I can stay and show up in the way that I want to. And there's so much to say about the culture of medicine, how harmful it can be. And I think maybe the simplest way I always think about it is that the same systems of oppression that play in our national and political environment play their same role in the culture of medicine. The same degree of systemic racism, the same degree of homophobia, of ableism, all those things are just as prevalent and particularly so harmful to those who are marginalized within the dominant group of healthcare. And there's so many ways this plays out in how we choose to train, the way that medical school, the way residency is structured, what is valued. And then I think the hidden curriculum and that like the conversations about that get at some of those ideas. But I don't know if it says quite enough how much the culture of white supremacy is at play in the way that we navigate the culture of medicine, how much urgency, perfectionism, productivity are amplified so much more, and how much more of those metrics can make it feel like the things that we do that actually also matter, like holding hands, by listening, by slowing down. That will never have a metric, that will never be associated with an RVU, and how those things are almost invisible work in healthcare, even though those are the things that all of us would want for our own family members. There was a very beautiful paper that talked about one of the ways that the physician burnout discourse gaslights all of us is because it really obscures the psychological and emotional distress that comes from this culture. And that burnout traditionally has focused so much on the individual, that it focuses so much on our own ability to work in the system that it is. And it centers ideas that have been truly co opted of resilience and professional fulfillment. And it takes practices such as mindfulness, which are rooted in a deep ethic, and decontextualize these things primarily with the focus of how do we operate and see more patients and do the actual workload. But instead, it just distracts, I think, from recognizing that what is really harming us and our patients is these systems of oppression that exert harm, that scapegoat individuals, that make it very difficult for those who are agitating the system to remain in the system as well. And so, as much as I believe the culture of medicine is slowly changing, it is very different than when I went to medical school. AMSA, as far as I know, did not exist in with this radical nature at that time, almost 15 years ago. But I think there's still much to be done and much to continue to work on. And I won't elaborate too much on structural inequities since that is so much of the rest of the week of M1. And then you'll have so many other amazing scholars and doctors and activists who are talking so deeply about the role of structural inequities and injustice. I name it because I think healthcare education tries to pretend, I guess, that healthcare is apolitical, and it's not. Like these very real structures impact our ability to do our jobs, and everyday impacts of immigration, of food insecurity, of housing insecurity are directly part of my job in taking care of families. And so I think when we recognize that that is something that makes our job hard, and that is something that we bear witness to, and that we sometimes cannot change, that it is important to know that we can talk about those things with each other and grieve and also recognize when we do the most that we can with the resources that we have. Our organization talks a lot about moral distress, and I think for us, for Laura and myself, a few years into our journey, we recognize that all the feeling, many of the feelings that we were struggling with actually had a name. And it was well documented actually in the nursing literature and in the veterans literature. And that moral distress is that feeling of knowing the right thing to do, but having institutional or systemic constraints that make it nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action. And it makes sense that this originated from our nursing colleagues because many of them were often placed in this position by physicians, having to implement things that they disagreed with and having to really struggle with grappling with that. And I think now, so there's been tons of research in the 1980s from when this originated to say that all of us experience moral distress, especially physicians, even though we are at what is considered the top of the medical hierarchy. In some ways, that hierarchy itself causes us so much distress because of how it challenges us to engage in behaviors of perfectionism and urgency in ways that are very deeply unhealthy. And moral distress is so important to name because it's different than burnout. It's a unique characteristic that is related to having a dissonance with our innermost values and our ability to enact those things in the way that we want to actually take care of patients. And over time, that distress, when happened in a repeated nature, can become moral injury. And moral injury is when we start to feel like we're having violations of our deeply held moral beliefs and values. And it can be really, really difficult to not feel even stronger and stronger reactions every incident that you have because that impact is cumulative. In some of our work, we asked folks, how would you describe what moral distress is? And some of the stories that people shared relate to some of the things that we talked about, witnessing systemic inequity, the harms in the medical culture, and bearing witness to a lot of those things is really challenging. And I feel like especially in medical school, early on in your training, when you may not be the person who's leading some of these conversations, or you may not be some of the person who is initiating how care is being implemented, it can be even more distressing to watch things that you're like, I don't think they're listening to that family. I think that people are operating based on racist assumptions. And it can be so deeply hard in the medical hierarchy to be able, for people to hear that and for us to voice our concerns, especially if you're worried about retaliation or pushback. And this slide is a very busy one, but I think I want to highlight is that what happens on the global and national political scale impacts the individual. There is no.
Uh-oh, did we lose her? Okay, my friends, I'm sure she'll join in just a moment. I'll reach out. Give me one sec. I'm sure probably even a computer. Yeah, computer died. Isn't that not all of us with a charger just not plugged in like we thought? Okay. I'd love to hear if anyone would like to share something that's resonating with them, but no pressure. You can feel free to use the chat as well if you'd like. I know for me, I was writing down a few things, but feels really nice to have somebody name that's actually in medicine that crossroads that they were at, and then to be able to years later do something so different about it, to create a space like that feels like it gives me a lot of hope for what we can do. Oh, there you are. Hi.
Hello, my friends. I'm so sorry. My computer just blacked out. So we're like, here we are.
You're okay. Go on. Yes. It happens to us all the time. We're students. We get it.
Yes, thank you. So I feel like I will ask you to share my slides if you don't mind, because I am on my phone.
Absolutely. Give me one
Thank
sec.
you.
Keep going. I was just talking with them about what was resonating. And Jamie was mentioning in the chat, if you want to read what she said, so all the systemic issues within the institutions. And I
Mhm.
completely agree. Okay, I'm about to share my screen, friends. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for your
Oh
patience.
my gosh, this happens to me all the time. You're fine. All good. Okay, one sec. I'll get to the actual slide. Okay, we were right here. Yep, we were
I
there.
think, yep, perfect. Yes.
Yes.
I think we're actually two more.
Oh,
Or maybe
sorry.
at
I
the
was
one with the
so
large
ready.
graphic.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yes. I know it's totally the middle of a sentence, so so sorry. But I think kind of landing on the point that what happens on the political and national level really impacts all of us as individuals, and there's no way to separate us from that. And I think that can be really challenging, especially when you are in a clinic or in a hospital and you're seeing those things really impact patients individually, but nobody's really talking about it or explicitly naming, like, oh, I think this family or this person is navigating what is clearly a systemic level issue of being able to access medication, to being able to access appointments, or being able to access transportation. And even worse is when people use judgmental language, kind of judging or critiquing people who don't have access to things. And I think when we keep this context in mind of like all the things that we're witnessing, whether or not we're the ones implementing decisions or we're the ones leading conversations, we recognize that like we are bearing the weight of all of that stuff. And that is a very, very real toll that many, many healthcare workers are navigating right now. And also, I think the thing that is both painful and beautiful is recognizing like we are so deeply interconnected. We're interconnected as healthcare workers and we're interconnected with our patients. And I think that's the thing that is so harmful about the medical hierarchy is how much we internalize that hierarchy within ourselves, that we believe that we may be better or know more than our patients. And I think it's important to recognize like, yes, we have a very specialized skill set of training that is very valuable. And to say that we can lateralize that is not accurate. But I also think there's a different form of hierarchy when you believe you're better than someone versus like you recognize you have a skill set and knowledge base that is different than someone that you're serving. And I think kind of centering this idea of like what can we do to, especially if we recognize that patients and clinicians are intertwined in a broken system together. Next slide, please. And I think for us in our organization, this is one of the fundamental questions that we really think about, is because we know when clinicians are treated well, when we are able to feel a sense of belonging, whenever we feel like we're able to do the job in a way that feels aligned with our values, that we are better doctors, we are better nurses, we are better clinicians. Our patients are directly impacted by that. And so, how we are is inexplicably intertwined with patients. And so then the question is, what can we really do about it? Next slide, please. And so I'll share a little bit about our work with introspective spaces now and kind of throughout our conversation. But what has taken us 5 years, we're about 5 years old as an organization, to really be able to articulate is our hope is to create spaces for community care for healthcare workers, to really recognize that being able to take care of each other is something that we already have access to. And I think for us, one thing that's very important is really thinking about what if humanizing healthcare begins with us by humanizing each other. And so our work is really creating these interdisciplinary spaces for healthcare workers, mental health clinicians to connect with each other using art and ritual. And I think one of the things that we always share about our work too is like, we did not create any of this. All of this work was handed down to us from activists, from contemplatives, from theologians, from scholars, from artists. And all we try to do is create these spaces for healthcare workers to be in community together and to feel so much less isolated, to be able to reconnect with themselves, to slow down enough to feel the things that they're actually experiencing and to do that in the company of other people who also care about them too. And so some of these pictures are just from some of our different gatherings that people have had with um, creating art and doing different types of like rituals and fun, yeah, just like beautiful gatherings with each other. Next slide. And so when we think about what does sustainable activism mean, I don't know if this is actually really a term, but it's like the best way I can think to describe this idea of what does it mean to be an activist and to be someone who's fighting for justice in a way that does not require us to constantly burn out and engage in personal harm. And I think doing this work sustainably feels impossible given the urgency and the degree of work that needs to be done. But I also think that there's probably no more important question, because our ability to stay in this game long term is also how we can start to build these worlds that we want our children or children's children to inherit. And I love this quote from Stephen Covey, which comes from Adrienne Maree Brown's book, Emergent Strategy. Change moves at the speed of trust. And I think every time I read that, I can feel myself physically slowing down, and also to feel in my body how true that is, that change can only move at that scale. And so anything that is done from that sense of urgency, as Adrienne Brown says, runs the risk of replicating the same harms that got us here in the first place. Next slide. And so I think the question we ask is, how do we equip ourselves for this generational work? Next slide. And for us, what we think is so powerful is to be able to tend to our inner world, but in community. And that builds our capacity to fight for change. A Buddhist parable that I really like, that I feel like helps me articulate what this means, is when someone pours salt into a glass of water, we are not able to drink it. It's too salty. But when you pour salt into a lake, you can't taste it. And I think when we think about how do we build our capacity to fight for change, we're really asking ourselves, how do we build our inner lake to be able to hold the salt of our world, the salt of our patients, and who also can hold our salt, who has that capacity to be able to hold space for us. Next slide. And I'm sharing two activists throughout history who I admire, and also I think, even more importantly, to demonstrate that even the people who we idolize, who we know have done so much good, did not do this work alone. Martin Luther King, who has written prolific text, who has been such an inspirational figure in the civil rights movement, he himself also had many moments of despair. And the person pictured to the left, Howard Thurman, was a theologian who personally supported and mentored Martin Luther King. And there's many books written about their relationship and their mentorship. And I think it's part of the story that doesn't often get told is that Martin Luther King did not operate in a vacuum. He operated within a deep sense of community. As much as he promoted beloved community, he was also part of a community, and that he had people who mentored and cared for him. Next slide. And Adrienne Maree Brown, who I'll have referenced and will reference many times in this talk, who's someone I deeply admire, was mentored by Grace Lee Boggs, who's pictured here. And she writes in many of her books about how important that mentorship has been and how important it is to be doing this work in community and to know that we are not meant to do any of this change work alone. Next slide. This tree is called the Tree of Contemplative Practice, and it comes from, I believe, the Contemplative Society, Mind and Society. And I think it's a beautiful demonstration of all the ways that we can engage in practices that allow us to reconnect with ourselves and each other, of which activism actually is a practice that can help us be grounded. And there's so many different ways that we can engage in these grounding practices. And so I love this tree because I think it also reminds us, especially if we feel like I'm interested in thinking about something that will help me slow down and process, but I don't know where to begin. I think this is a beautiful example of so many ideas that people have used in different cultural and spiritual traditions around the world to help with building that sense of community and also tending to the inner worlds that we all have. Next slide. So of course, when we think about activism, action is one of the things that is most important. And so in this talk today, I'm not talking as much about the direct actions that we can do towards justice, because I know many, many people that will be speaking this week will be talking about that. But I'll be focusing more on these bigger ideas of joy, grief, creativity, and community care. And there's so many practices that I'm not talking about, and there's so many other ways to care for ourselves. But these are the four that I'm very passionate about and I have found to be really helpful in my own sustainability. And so we will briefly go through each one and then try out a practice. Next slide. I think talking about joy and activism can feel deeply paradoxical. And I think it literally does relate to the idea of holding paradox, that we have the capacity to both understand the gravity and the weight of the issues at hand, and also embrace moments of celebration, connection, and hope to sustain us. Next slide. And I love this quote by Now Biondi that says, "Joy is what makes resilience even possible. It connects us to what we're fighting for, not just what we're fighting against. It reminds us that we're more than our trauma, that we're worthy of goodness, softness, and celebration." And so I think when we think about our movements of how do we stay in this game long term to be able to reimagine a new way in healthcare system as a system that centers our patients, that centers community, in addition to all of the phone calls and petitions and protests and all those things that are so important, I think carving out spaces to celebrate, to engage in joy, to recognize this also coexists along with the deep suffering that we're witnessing. Next slide. And so, with that, we're going to try a small joy practice. I'm going to read a small text from this book by Ross Gay, who's one of my favorite poets. For a year, he wrote an essay on delight for 365 days, published in this book. And part of that, in that practice, he recognized that in writing about delight every day, he developed a delight radar and was starting to notice more and more things that brought him joy. And I think it can be really tough to hold, again, the complexity of this because sometimes when we're told, like, oh, just write three things you're grateful for, you can just feel like that internal, like, oh, I don't want to do that. That's dismissing the gravity of what's going on. And so I think one of the ways I reframe it is saying to myself, this practice of joy and delight is meant to remind me that beauty and suffering coexist, They have existed and cannot ever be fully separated. And so, one of the things I want us to try together is after I read this brief passage, I'd love to give folks maybe 3 minutes to just write a list of whatever brings you delight. It can be something now, it can be something later. So I'll start with this just to offer some inspiration and then we'll move from there. Tap, tap. I take it as no small gesture of solidarity and more to the point love, or even more to the point tenderness, when the brother working as a flight attendant, maybe about 50, the beginning of gray in his fade, his American Airlines vest snug on his sturdily built torso, walking backward in front of the cart, after putting my seltzer on the tray table, said, "There you go, man," and tapped my arm twice. Tap, tap. Oh, let me never cease extolling the virtues and my adoration of the warranted familiarity. You see family in that word, don't you? Family? Expressed by look or tone of voice. Or today on this airplane between Indianapolis and Charlotte. Those are real places, lest we forget. A tap, two, tap tap on the triceps. By which is really a kind of miracle. This express a social and bodily intimacy on this airplane, at this moment in history, our particular bodies, making the social contract of mostly not touching each other irrelevant, or rather, writing a brief addendum that acknowledges the official American policy, which is a kind of de facto and terrible touching of some of us are trying to, always figuring out ways to keep touching us. And this flight attendant, tap tap, reminding me, like that, simply remember, tap tap, how else we might be touched and are. There. There you go, man. So I'm gonna give everyone maybe 3 minutes and then write as much as you can with as much detail, using all of your senses to think about what are things that bring you joy, delight, that make you laugh out loud, and give yourself these 3 minutes just to bring those things to mind. And then for whoever feels comfortable unmuting and sharing or sharing in the chat, we'll share some of our lists. I'll have folks take just another minute. Or actually, no, we actually are at 3 minutes. Wow, happened so quickly. Would love anyone who feels comfortable unmuting and sharing to absolutely feel free to do that, or folks want to share in the chat, maybe a few things that bring them delight.
I feel comfortable sharing. Hey all, my name is Caleb. I kind of just started listing random things, and also it's so great to see a bunch of people and to be here with you guys. So excited. But rambling about the list that I have, watching TV, going to church, talking and hanging with friends, the idea of love, running into friends when
Mm.
I'm around town or during errands, hearing from passionate leaders, listening to live performances on YouTube, album drops, hugs, reunions, and having memories. That's
Mm.
like my rundown.
I love that, Caleb. Thank you so much for sharing. Really, I felt those.
Well, of course.
I'm happy to read in the chat. Caleb, I'm so happy you're here. I can't even express. Um, food, yes. I
Mhm.
love that very much so. Healing practices around food can be very
Mm.
restorative. Do others feel called to put in the chat? I'm happy to read it. Music.
Mm.
Mm. I wrote down that something that kind of made me laugh, but there's a joke I have with my partner that as soon as my last task is over, I shut my laptop, not super hard, but enough to like, it's a joy though, because I notice at this moment, I transition into a different state. So I really love, very peaceful, like transitional moments bring me peace, knowing when things begin and end.
I love that.
Do
I think
others?
the one I wrote. Yeah, I was
Go
gonna say if
ahead.
other folks
No,
have.
no, no, please go share with us.
Oh, I love that one. Rediscovering an old forget. I love that. I think
Oh,
one for me, there's been a mother hummingbird that's made a nest on our street. And so we will try to visit her a few times a week and see how they're doing. And I took my toddler there and showed him a hummingbird. So it was really lovely.
that's so sweet. I love that. I'll read these two. Armand says, so you mentioned part of this, rediscovering an old forgotten song, the smell of freshly baked cookies in the house,
Mm.
spending time with his mom, watching Great British Bake Off, making time for the gym, and then going
Oh,
on walks early in the morning when the sun is out and there's no clouds.
oh, so beautiful. All right, my friends, thank you for sharing. We will talk about our next practice. The next thing I want to talk about, which feels different, but I feel like is actually very intertwined, is grief. And I like this quote from Camille Sapara Barton, who wrote an incredible book called Tending Grief, which really talks about the role of grief in activist spaces. And before I go into this, I want to just like name again that talking about grief can also bring a lot of really challenging feelings or emotions. So please feel free to step away. We're not going to go too deep into this. Happy to always talk offline with folks. But I also think really important to name how grief offers us an important tool within our movement spaces. And this quote, joy is not the opposite of grief. Grief is the opposite of indifference. I think to me really named that like our ability to have collective grief has historically fueled many social justice movements. And that tending to grief, to loss, recognizing and reconnecting to these cycles of life and death are not a part of our healthcare culture, but I think are so deeply important to recognizing that we're humans witnessing other humans navigating these really difficult parts of this life. And one of the things that brought me the most moral distress during my training was that I felt like I was the only one who was so emotionally impacted by witnessing suffering or witnessing patients die, and I felt like even asking for folks to debrief or to share what happened or how they felt was such a difficult undertaking. And now looking back, I recognize that it wasn't that I was too sensitive to do this job. I was having a very human reaction to what was going on and to what I was witnessing. Next slide, please. And one of the ways that our organization has hosted Space for Grief is we host grief spaces for healthcare workers. And so we've hosted grief spaces for Gaza to kind of mourn the healthcare workers who've been killed. We write poetry about grief. We give people those spaces to mourn not only patients they've lost, but also the grief of injustice that we all carry. And for myself too, because I work in a system that is very intertwined with what is happening politically, I recognize that every shift I carry a little bit of grief as well, because I know that I care for a very vulnerable population and very vulnerable communities who don't receive all the resources and care that they deserve. Next slide, please. And so there's so much to say about grief, and I name it just in case anyone feels like this is a part of their healthcare experience that has been unacknowledged or unnamed, because I felt like it was for me until well after I graduated. And so the brief grief practice that I think we'll do together today is just reconnecting with our bodies. And I think that can be for many people the first step of even noticing when you're starting to feel grief or a reaction even to what's going on, is to slow down and just notice what's happening in your body. So I'll do a very quick 2-minute body scan. And so I'll encourage everyone to sit somewhere comfortable. Again, for those commuting, do what feels good. And so I'll encourage everyone to close your eyes, look at something in front of you. Start with your head. Notice your forehead. Is it tense or tight? Move down to your jaw. Is it clenched? Have you been holding a lot of pressure? See if you can just observe non judgmentally what you notice. Move down to your shoulders, a part of our body that holds a lot of our tension that we may be contracting and we don't even realize. Feel free to move it up and down. Just notice what you see. Does it feel tight or loose? Move down your back. Our backs hold us up all day, but carry a lot of the tension and stress that we navigate to. Just pay attention. Maybe this is the first time that you're noticing and just observing what's going on in your body. Just notice if there's areas that feel loose or tight or parts that you want to stretch or move. Move down to your legs. Can briefly lift them up or down. Notice your feet on the floor. Notice what it feels like to be grounded. Notice if you're carrying any tension. Just notice that area. Give it some kindness and love. And then end with your feet grounded on the floor, connecting us to this earth. And feel free to open your eyes. One of the reasons connecting with our bodies is so related to grief is, of course, so much of our physical reactions to things are in our bodies, that we may feel nervous and sometimes we have stomach aches. And I think grief is no different. But I think in so much of our training, we spend much of our day disconnected from our bodies. And in some ways, that's even really celebrated. And that, how many times have we heard as a mark of honor, like, oh, I went this whole day without eating lunch. I haven't peed all day. I haven't had any water. And I think instead of us recognizing, oh, maybe we should actually change something about how we construct our days so that we all can do those things, instead, we spend many, many years disconnected from our bodies trying to get the work done. And for many healthcare workers, will do whatever they can to prevent patient harm and often at the own jeopardy of their bodies. And so I think one of the first ways to gradually reintroduce our connection to feeling all the things that come up in our clinical roles is being able to do this really brief practice that I just shared of just noticing what's going on in your body and offering yourself kindness and no judgment. And I think the more times that you have this opportunity just to scan your body in moments that are really challenging, you have a practice you can come back to that helps you recognize, like, oh, I think my body is telling me something that maybe my mind is not ready to listen to. So it's something that I've had to work on a lot and have had to learn to process in my own mental health therapy space, recognizing that grief is just going to be a part of coexisting in my healthcare practice. Next slide. And already we've engaged in a lot of creativity. And I name it specifically just to talk about its important role in cultivating imagination. And so creativity is something that can be so widely utilized because it's a inherent part of who we are as people. And creativity gives us these tools that we can offer for presence, for storytelling, for community building, and I think most importantly for cultivating imagination, which is something we all need to even think about how do we build a world that is rooted in the values that we really want to be centering, not just how do we fight against the things that we disagree with. And so we think creativity is this contemplative tool for connecting with ourselves and for each other. That's why so much of our work engages with creativity. And for many of us, before we went into medical school, we actually were very creative beings, whether it was like doing an actual art practice or centering creative things or endeavors. And over a very rigorous training period, we often don't prioritize time for this. And there's not almost any incentive from our clinical or professional roles to ask or even recognize the utility of having these practices, both for processing things that are almost impossible to put into words, as well as opportunities for slowing down and connection. And so I think creativity, maintaining a creativity practice throughout training that doesn't have to be laborious or time sensitive or time intensive, I think can be really meaningful to know that there's something that you have just for you that you can come back to that can help you slowly process the things that you're witnessing and seeing, even before you necessarily have the words for them. Next slide. And so these are some examples of some of the creative practices that we've done with healthcare workers. One of our favorite exercises is asking people to write a headline about their work life. And so these are some of the ones that people have shared. What happens when healthcare workers write themselves back into the story? A baby arrival, pharmacy shortage, limited coverage. Nurse practitioner ready for a change, but will it be different somewhere else? And it's sometimes really so amazing to see what people come up with that they didn't even realize that they were thinking about just with the opportunity to write for 2 or 3 minutes with no purpose besides just expressing themselves. Next slide. And no need to share the video, but this is a picture of our kindness garden that we had created for a hospital's Unity and Kindness Day. And we had folks create a rock garden of mutuality where they would give and receive words of kindness. So it was a very small creative practice, but I think it ended up being really beautiful because many of those rocks now live in the garden of the hospital. And it became the small way for folks to offer each other a token of care while also getting to be fun and creative in a small way at work. Next slide. And so I know we're short on time, and so I would maybe love to do this practice, and then we'll just start the next one. And after this, and I hope that's when folks can continue because that's a much more intensive one. But I'd love to give folks an opportunity to try this haiku practice that we do a lot actually in many of the gatherings we have with healthcare workers. And so we love a haiku. It's very structured as a form of poetry, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. Um, I want to give everyone maybe another 3 minutes. Just do some rapid poetry. You can follow these rules, you can break these rules. Doesn't really matter. But we want everyone to just give it a try. If you want to share something about yourself in haiku form, what would that be? So we'll take 3 minutes, and then whoever feels called to unmute, feel free, or if you want to share in the chat. All right, my friends, I'll have y'all come back together. Feel free to keep writing. Feel free to keep doing this. It can sometimes be really fun just to keep writing little haikus throughout your day. But if anyone has anything they'd like to share, feel free or to share in the chat. And also, naming can be really vulnerable to write rapid poetry.
Also, feel free to share in the chat either the whole haiku or something that you maybe even thematically what came to your heart. That's okay.
Mhm.
Anything you'd like to share. I can share a little. I was struggling with finishing how I wanted to, but I spoke about wheels continuing to turn because for me, I'm noticing a lot of, as we all do, that the thinking doesn't pause, right? So, like, we're always in active
Mhm.
go mode. So, I've had like tires and wheels in my mind a lot as imagery lately. So, I was working from that stance as like the theme of like how it feels to constantly be going and wanting to pause, but didn't quite fulfill the whole thing yet. So, still working on it. So, curious on others.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's such an important image also because I think that's one of the things that can be really powerful about creative practice is it does force us to slow down and recognize when we're like, "Oh, I've just been going this whole time." And it can feel and I think it can feel really hard to do something imperfectly or for it to not be the finished product. And I think so much of our time we spend trying to master a skill, whether it's through studying, whether it's through a clinical or procedural skill, and that in some ways having creative practices and constraints, like doing it very quickly or with intuition, can be really helpful because there's no way for it to be good. It's not possible. And so
Mm,
I think allowing yourselves that opportunity to let something that can be messy and imperfect, and to kind of grapple with how the ways that our perfectionism can really show up, even outside of our clinical roles.
thank you so much. That really resonates. Reminds me of the quote earlier, the change moves at the speed of trust. It's like,
Mhm.
yes. Okay.
Perfect. And I hope for folks, please keep writing, keep doing poetry. 100% do not need to share with anyone ever. And I'll go to the next slide. I don't think we'll have time to do this full practice, but I wanted to share it just as an opportunity for folks to engage in something creative, kind of on your own as you're thinking about how do we tie in all of these things that we've been talking about. And so, this idea of community care is fundamentally thinking about when we approach well being, how do we do so in a way that benefits us as a collective and not just me as an individual? And oftentimes, many of the ways that we can do this are the same, that we can engage in these contemplative practices like meditation or like mindfulness or art or joy. All those things can be things that help foster our own sustainability. And also, we can do many of those things in community and also with an attention for how the people in our community are doing. And so, I think when we center community in our ways of approaching well being, we think about everything so differently. If we think about how is my med school class? How are the people in my department? How do we expand this to not just be the people in our hospital, but also the people in our community? And to know that unless we have that ability for all of us to be well, none of us are truly well. Next slide. And so I'm sharing this practice that I hope you all can take with you about mapping your ecosystem of care. And this is a way of thinking about the people, places, and practices that sustain you. Next slide. And so we got this beautiful image from designer Catalina Alzate, whose work you should definitely look up, and who very graciously let us use this design as a template for folks to think about how do we build an ecosystem of care. And also to recognize that no matter where we're beginning, none of us are beginning this work alone, that we are members right now of communities, that we have connections to the earth and to places that ground us. And we also have practices that we can access when we are struggling with some of the harder parts of our roles in medicine that we can come back to. And sometimes in those moments of distress or despair, it can just be really hard to remember what those things are. You can go to the next slide. And so for folks who are doing this at home or for folks who are going to do this later, kind of drawing your own trunk and root system, and also asking yourself first, what grounds you? And around the root, writing the values that keep you anchored. And if you feel so inclined, thinking about where do those values come from? What is the story behind your value of justice or your value of community or your value of compassion? And to know that those values and the links that you have to your community, to your culture, to your spirituality are always with you in the hospital, even if people don't ask you about them or if it feels like they're not always welcome to share. Patients and your colleagues will always benefit from all of the diversity of our experience that we bring. Next slide. And then around the edges of the tree root, you can think about who or what sustains you. And if you draw this at home, thinking about the people who sustain you, the people in your corner who are there, who can hold the challenges, the weight of what you're navigating, the places that sustain you, and the people and the practices that sustain you. Are there practices that you feel like you haven't been tending to that you love, that you haven't had the time to do since you started training or if you started medical school or as you're thinking about navigating residency? What are small ways that you can bring those things back into your life, even imperfectly, even if it's just starting with making a list of all the things that bring you delight? And having this map available to you to know that this is a reference that you can have throughout your career that will grow and sustain, and that you can nurture the parts that you wish were more full, that you want to plant seeds in, and that this is something that will hold you in the hardest parts of your training and as in your career in medicine. Next slide. And so here's a visual in case for the visual folks in the room, if you want to try this out at home. Next slide. So I want to share, thank you so much. I know I had so many practices, so there wasn't quite enough time to do all of them, but I hope for folks that a rapid fire intersection was a way just to sample things, to try out some new practices, and to really, I hope, think about some of the questions that we raised today of how do we do this work sustainably? How do we tend to our own well-being, to the well-being of our collective in a way that allows us to continue fighting for the world that we imagine? And to do so in a way that is rooted in love and in joy, that has the capacity to hold the complexity of these emotions. And also so much gratitude to all the scholars and activists who came before us for Black History Month. I feel like there's so many activists I'd love to name and credit, but of course, Adrienne May Brown and Bell Hooks and Ross Gay, some of the folks that I named have been incredible inspirations for me as we even built our work with introspective spaces. And I wanted to end with a very short poem by a favorite poet of mine, Young Pueblo, and we'll send you off with this final word. Learning how to breathe and be okay when my mind feels dark and gray. To accept this passing moment without suppression or lasting fear. To know that the clouds moving through me do not define who I am or who I will be. Learning the art of letting go has been the skill my mind has always sought. Now I see I am a river, always changing while moving gently in the direction of total liberty. And I hope for all of you, as we navigate this really challenging time together, that you find the people, places, and practices that hold you in your own ecosystem of care. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. What a gorgeous, touching presentation. I will briefly say words of thanks and then open it up if anyone has any lasting comments on their heart or a question or two before you leave us. But on behalf of all of us here at AMSA, thank you for inviting us to slow down and to remember our roots, no pun intended, and to care and to tend for the things that make us who we are outside of our love for medicine. Because those are, like you said, the things that will sustain us. But they're not just our practice of care as a career, right? They're our practice of who we are. And that happens to be part of what we do for a living. And so, thank you so much for that. And would love to hear if anyone has any thoughts or questions. And you can use the chat as well, and I can read off. The chat was very active, if you'd like to see some of them.
I don't have any major comments, but again, this is Caleb. Hi, and off camera, sorry. But it's been a second since I've been back in an AMSA event. I've had a crazy year with a lot of research and a lot of other things I've been preparing for, and it's lovely to be welcomed back into the same supportive environment and uplifting environment that I think AMSA is always making sure they're putting forward. And thank you so much for being here. Like, this is something that I think a lot of people aren't casually spending their Tuesday afternoon doing, and I think that it's something that's really restorative, especially in this crazy time, and it just means a lot. So I just want to say thank you, truly, and I wish everyone the best like day.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you so much, Caleb.
You're always welcome in open arms, my friend. If anyone has any lasting questions or thoughts, if not, that's okay. We can also take note of anything that maybe comes up for you afterwards, because sometimes things really resonate after they've sat for a bit, and we can place you in touch with the students if they do have questions.
Absolutely.
Oh, is someone on mute? Okay, I'm not sure. I also want to thank you for inviting us to hold the complexity of dualities. And I think that's something that we really need right now. And so I just want to invite all of us to really sit with what we did today, and to know that sometimes slowing down feels, it's so counterintuitive. It can feel like we're wasting time. And that's actually the exact thing, that dangerous feeling in our bodies that comes up is really our invitation to listen and to recenter, so that as we continue in this field, we can come to it from a place that feels the most authentically aligned with who we've always been. So thank you for this so much. And we're so grateful to have had you tonight, and we hope to bring you back.
Yeah, thank you all, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.
I'll stop the recording here.